This is 90-second evidence, the extended cut. The extended cut. Now, I usually give you the bite-sized version over on TikTok or Instagram, but I'm actually wanting to start going into more depth here on YouTube. So I've actually gone through the research itself to pull out exactly what you need to know about neuroplasticity according to this article. And that way, you don't actually have to sift through the 20-page papers. Now, my name's Phil Lamoureux. I'm an occupational therapist and a certified personal trainer. And we are going to break down a 2019 review by Maier and colleagues who gave us strategies as a way to get the brain to make new connections. Now, the authors identify a major problem in our field, and that is that there is a massive gap between motor learning theory and actually what's applied in clinical work. Because let's face it, as therapists, we often lack the exact or specific recipe on how to actually make neuroplasticity happen. And Maier and the team identified 15 distinct ingredients that can help us actually bridge that gap. Their goal also wasn't to find a single magic bullet, but really the goal was to show us how to synthesize these ingredients as a way to restore the link between patients' actions and their sensory consequences. So if we actually look at the literature, one principle stands out. The authors explicitly cite task-specific practice as being considered the most successful strategy that we actually have. So this means training meaningful, functional tasks that are relevant to daily life. And it's really not just about moving, it's actually about moving with a purpose. The thing I always like to say is task-specific practice is practice the thing that you want to get better at, not the little components of it. But even if we use task-specific practice, it's not gonna work without the right dosage. Now, the paper points out a really hard truth, and that is that standard clinical care often provides an insufficient amount of therapy compared to what's actually been shown to get neuroplastic change. So to drive that change, we actually need high intensity, heavy repetition, and mass practice, which mass practice means working episodes with very brief rest periods. However, we do have to balance that with what we call space practice. And space practice is a real thing that really shows us that the brain needs structured intervals as a way to facilitate memory consolidation. Essentially, the brain needs some time to rest. And finding that balance between high intensity work and recovery time is actually where the clinical skill lies. Now, I believe that the real magic happens when you introduce variability and you increase difficulty. And the research actually supports this. Because variable task practice, which is practicing a skill in different ways, contexts, directions, actually leads to much better retention and a transfer of skills than just doing the same blocked practice over and over. And this has to be paired with increasing difficulty. You essentially have to find what the authors call the optimal challenge point, where you are constantly adjusting the functional task, the level of difficulty, and the variability related to the patient's skill level as a way to keep them engaged, but still being challenged. So if it's too easy, then plasticity is going to stall. So to keep the brain growing and making new connections, the challenge has to evolve as the patient does. Now, we also use goal-oriented practice here to structure these challenges around specific achievements, which will naturally boost focus and motivation. Now, next we have to look at how the patient perceives their movement. Maier breaks down feedback into two types. First, explicit feedback, or the knowledge of results, like you telling the patient you missed the target. And the second is implicit feedback, or their own knowledge of performance, which this goes into something that we'll talk about in the future, which is sensory motor. And really it's the feel of the movement itself. And we want to follow strategies like sensory motor adaptation and reinforcement as a way to make sure this feedback is actually going to stick. So stay tuned for future videos. Now, Maier and Associates, they talk about a way that you can augment what we've just talked about with what's called multisensory stimulation, which is using visual, auditory, or haptic cues like rhythmic cueing as a way to increase neuroplasticity. And they state that rhythmic cueing actually can be effective for gait. But for patients with limited movement, we can use what's called action observation, and that is used to activate the mirror neuron system. And then they also talk about what's called motor imagery as a way to mentally rehearse the movements. Now, so far what we've talked about are things that can really happen in your head. The thing that we also find oftentimes is learn non-use. And so using what's called modulate effector selection, like using CIMT, you can use that as a way to overcome learn non-use and force the brain to stop ignoring the affected limb. Now, one of the most underrated ingredients in this paper is called social interaction. Incorporating cooperation or competition doesn't just make rehab fun, it actually increases the behavioral drive and motivation that's needed to keep trying every day. So plasticity as a whole body or a whole person process can be pushed with other people. Now, finally, we want to watch for what's called interference. And what they state is that if we don't manage these 15 principles correctly, then they talk about bad habits or compensations can actually block the brain from learning a more efficient way to move. And the big takeaway that they bring up is that you can't rely on just one ingredient. Effective neurorehabilitation actually requires a synthesis of all of these principles. Neuroplasticity is the biological foundation for all new learning, and these strategies, they need to be added to your interventions. So use them as a checklist. You can check in the comments section below, I'll put them there. And use them as a way to ensure your work is actually changing the brain and not just passing the time. So now that you know a little bit more about neuroplasticity, you have this checklist that you can measure your interventions against, go and use it. Now, I just want to say thank you so much for watching this video. If you have comments, if you have an article that you'd like me to review and you'd like me to synthesize and break it down, go ahead and put it in the comment section. I have access to pretty much any article I want to get, and I would love to be able to synthesize different articles that maybe you're having a harder time understanding, or that you simply would just like to see how I synthesize it. So I can't wait to do more with you in the future. And here is to another successful 90-second evidence. Go and have some fun.